Hey everybody, my name's Ed. Okay, so today we're going to do something a little bit different today. We're going to do another deep dive, but this one's going to be a bit different. I'm going to cover a couple different comics that came out of back in the 80s, but I wanted to provide a lot of context, a lot of real world context, and a lot of comic book context. So this video is going to be a bit longer than the normal videos. Please, everybody, if you enjoy this video, if you make it to the end, like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, do all those things. Okay, so here we go. So I do want to talk about these comics that all came out in 1986. So that is a Green Lantern Corps number 208, 209, 210, Justice League number 2, and then number 3. Okay, so they all kind of represent the time they released and say something about the politics of the time and kind of the creators' viewpoints and what the audience was willing to accept as so-called politics in comics. Okay, so these comics aren't quite crossovers, but they do kind of loosely tie into each other, and they are definitely part of DC Comics' post-crisis world building. They definitely tie into a broader pop culture narrative. The Cold War went on for roughly 45-ish years, and art and entertainment, including comics, definitely participated. So let's kind of talk about DC Comics in 86 a bit, all right? Crisis on Infinite Earths was a 12-issue limited series that spanned the entirety of the DC universe, released in 1986. It, along with a few other titles, pretty much redefined DC Comics. It's worth mentioning that 1986 was a pivotal year for comics just in general. Not only did you have Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns, and both plots themselves feature Cold War and nuclear politics, but in addition to Crisis on Infinite Earths, Dark Knight, Watchmen, you also had the original black and white version of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and the first version of Mouse by Art Spiegelman. And most of these things had an effect and influence on the entirety of the commercial industry and the direct market, and or also the art of making comics. So at the time, DC superhero universe was made up of multiple Earths. So you had Earth 1, which was the classic DC universe, Earth 2, which was the Golden Age DC universe, Earth 3, the evil versions of the characters, Earth S, these are Shazam characters, Earth X, these are the characters that DC bought from Quality Comics. They being DC, were also hiring a lot of new writers and creators and artists who were trying to breathe new life into their characters. And so the premise of Crisis was that all the multiple Earths and parallel worlds will be collapsed into a more cohesive universe or timeline. And Crisis took a couple of years to plan out, and it was a way to, like I said, streamline the continuity of their superhero universe while at the same time create an event that would generate publicity and get readers interested in their new comics and creators at DC. So a few of the mainstream superheroes ended up getting completely new origins and backstories, while some of the others were just sort of more tweaked for more modern times. The Cold War went roughly from the late 40s to early 90s. Dropping atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended World War II, but started the arms race between the U.S. and the Soviets into high gear. You had a lot of pro-atomic energy propaganda proliferating in the United States, as did the paranoia, duck and cover films showing the school children in the 50s to prepare them for the possibility of nuclear war. Atomic energy is a constant presence in sci-fi movies and comics of the time. A lot of superheroes of the Silver Age roughly being 1956 to 1970-ish, are directly tied to Cold War politics. Many superheroes got their powers due to atomic energy. Early issues of the Fantastic Four, Iron Man, other titles presented communists as villains, and so on. Okay, so the Doomsday Clock was a symbolic clock that tracks the likelihood of nuclear war. It was established in 1947 and set at 7 minutes to midnight. And the idea is that when this clock strikes midnight, that's when nuclear war would actually break out. So, nuclear war specifically and energy in general was a very scary thing to a lot of people. Radiation leakage and fallout from accidents were on the minds of the public. In the 70s and early 80s, there was a strong anti nuclear movement in the States and in Europe. You had things like the 3 Mile Island accident in 1979 and 1986. There was the Chernobyl disaster in Russia. There was actually, speaking of comics, an editorial in Eclipse Comics called Dead Reds by Kat. I don't know how you say her name. Ronwode. Yronwode. She was the editor in chief there at the time, and her editorial really went hard and decried the whole Chernobyl incident and the ideal of nuclear power, calling into question the safety of nuclear power just in general. In 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected as president of the United States. He was a conservative Republican. He started his career as a radio broadcaster and an actor, and during the 50s, he was president of the Screen Actors Guild. This was the height of the McCarthy era, and Ronald Reagan did a lot to root out communists from Hollywood, we'll say, and the entertainment industry. During the 60s, he moved more into more formal politics. In 1967, he was elected governor of California. He was, again, a staunch anti-communist. So after being elected president of the United States, he greatly increased military spending. He saw the Soviet Union as a great threat, and he gave an infamous evil empire speech about the USSR in 1983. 1984, a hot mic caught him joking, "I have outlawed the Soviet Union. Bombing begins in 5 minutes." The Doomsday Clock then was moved from up to 3 minutes to midnight. Not just because of that. There were also things like the Soviets being involved in Afghanistan and stuff. But yeah, didn't gotta help. All right, so a lot of popular movies released during the 80s really leaned into the us versus them ideology of the Cold War. Uh, Rambo 2, or Rambo First Blood Part 2, I guess that's the real title. Red Dawn, Top Gun, Rocky 3, Platoon, Iron Eagle, Rambo 3. I can argue that you could even count something like G.I. Joe cartoons. In those, the bad guys aren't really communists per se, but the show still had a very pro-military viewpoint. There was a whole subset of Back to Nam movies that were recontextualized America's involvement in the Vietnam War. A movie like Road Warrior, while it's not about the Cold War, it's set in a post-apocalyptic world that's implied to have occurred after two mighty tribes went to war. And we're not even going to get into the hundreds of sci-fi or horror movies about World War III. So while most of these movies were meant as lightweight entertainment, it is worth mentioning that, or I should say, one movie that's worth mentioning is The Day After, which was a made-for-TV movie about nuclear destruction and what life could be like after such a war. It actually had an impact on Ronald Reagan, who was president at the time, and it did cause him to think a little bit more seriously about de-escalation of the nuclear arms race. You also had like pop songs. Many pop songs at the time referenced nuclear discussion. You had things like Nana's 99 Red Balloons. Prince had a song called Ronnie, Let's Talk to Russia. Sting had his song called Russians. I hope the Russians love their children too. Iron Maiden had a song called 2 Minutes to Midnight. And there's, a matter of fact, 100, punk and metal bands that have songs about World War III and bombs. So anyway, this was kind of the cultural climate in which these comic books were produced. So the Green Lantern Corps was an organization created by the Guardians of Oa. And they established the GL Corps to police the universe. The members of the Corps have power rings that can create hard-like constructs based on whatever the user can imagine. Post-crisis, the Guardians of Oa had broken up, and the Corps was Hal Jordan, who was the main Silver Age Green Lantern, and his friends and a small group of aliens living on Earth. The Justice League were formerly the world's greatest heroes, and by the time of the crisis were a group of young, hip, trendy heroes who, looking back now, seem kind of dated, and they were living in Detroit. Post-Crisis, they were killed off, and the new League was Batman and a cast of more traditional heroes, who included Guy Gardner, who was also at that same time part of the Green Lantern comic.
So the plot was written by Steve Englehart and the artist by Joe Staton. Steve had done a lot of work for Marvel and DC Comics, including well-regarded runs on titles like Captain America, The Avengers, and Batman. Joe had done a lot of work for Marvel and DC and Indie Comics. He also co-created E-Man along with Nick Cuti, C-U-T-I. I never know how to say his name, at Charleston. And so...
So the Green Lantern story concerns Kilowog, one of Hal Jordan's alien friends, going to Russia, and after having the USSR misrepresented to him, thinks maybe he prefers their system of government to the USA. Russia is described as a workers' paradise where all the people are equal, and Kilowog is from another planet, so he doesn't understand Earth politics, so he's easily deceived by Soviet spies. He agrees to help them invent superheroes for the Soviet Union called the Red Rockets. John Stewart and Cat, other Green Lanterns, go there to get him back and are captured by the Soviets. Guy Gardner will not let this stand, so Guy goes to Russia to save John and Cat and convince Kilowog of the Russia's deception. We see scenes of both Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev, the then president of the USSR, going to Condition Red. After the other Green Lanterns stall Soviet fighter jets and stop missiles from attacking America, Kilowog is forced to fight his friend Joseph, the first Red Rocket, and who dies in battle, and Kilowog sees the light about the Soviets' duplicity. We talked about 80's Cold War movies. The Green Lantern story actually references both Red Dawn and Top Gun, which were huge hits when these comics came out.
So, Keith Geffen has had a long career in comics with Marvel and DC. His most notable work being this particular run on Justice League. He's done stuff for Legion of Superheroes and did Ambush Bug, as well as Annihilation, Conquest, and Defenders for Marvel. J.M. DeMatteis, again, Marvel and DC guy. He's most known again for this run on Justice League, Captain America, and also his creator-owned series Moonshadow. And the art here is by Kevin McGuire, again, art for Marvel and DC Comics, Indie Comics, again, this run of Justice League, and people probably know him for late 90s run of Defenders, again, along with Geffen and DeMatteis. All right,
So in the Justice League story, basically a team of superheroes who are a very loose parody of the Avengers come from a parallel Earth to the Justice League's world. The other heroes' world has ended due to nuclear war, and in an effort to prevent this from happening to any other world, they come to our Earth to destroy all nuclear weapons. They ultimately, due to the influence of a corrupt general of a Soviet satellite state, set their sights on destroying the Soviet Union's stockpile. The Justice League realized that this would look like an attack from the U.S. towards the USSR, especially concerning what just happened in the Green Lantern comics a few months prior, and would in fact start World War III, so they tried to stop them. A climatic fight occurs at a Russian nuclear power plant when one of the alternative world heroes sacrifices himself to prevent the plant from exploding. The alternative world heroes see the error of the ways of the Justice League, are then kicked out of Russia by bureaucrats. So, as again, World War III was on the minds of most people in the general public. During this time, mutually assured destruction was seen as the natural outcome. This hung over the consciousness of most people, both here and abroad, and was just part of the general zeitgeist. Both of these comics suggest that if a war between America and Russia did happen, the end of the world would be the only result. Both of these comics also suggest that a stalemate between the USSR and the US is just the best that the world could hope for. The Green Lantern story does seem to lean a little bit more into the conservative anti-Soviet point of view a bit. It's clear in its criticism of the Soviet system of government and the belief that Mikhail Gorbachev is probably corrupt and that the USSR only lies to its people. The Justice League story seems to have a slightly more sympathetic or middle of the road view. It doesn't vilify Russia per se, instead places a lot of the corruption of the communist system on a fictional general of a Soviet state.
Both stories present the Soviet military leaders as liars who trick naive and well-meaning people into doing their bidding.
In both stories, Guy Gardner, who eventually becomes one of the more popular characters in the Green Lantern mythos, moves much of the action. Guy is portrayed in DC Comics at this time as kind of a lovable macho jerk, but he's also seen as an otherwise honorable person, however bullheaded and obnoxious. The Green Lantern story actually portrays Guy as being on the right side of the conflict. Gorbachev has in fact lied to Kilowog. The Soviets did in fact hold John and Kat captive, and they even lied to Joseph, the Russian soldier who volunteered to be the first Red Rocket. The Justice League story suggests that Guy's a bit dumb about the political situation, but doesn't really do a great job of explaining why. Guy at some point basically says something like, "Oh, the only person we can trust with nuclear arms is Ronald Reagan," and the other heroes call him stupid and say, "Even a first grader understands the situation better than you." Okay, well, then what's the situation? They don't really go into it. The Justice League does lament the fact that while they wanted to help the Russians, they somehow ended up just having to fight them. They eventually do end the more or less talking through with the Red Rockets. Ronald Reagan doesn't appear in this story as he does in in the Green Lantern story, but Gorbachev does, and he's seen as slightly more thoughtful in this comic than in the Green Lantern one.
So both were sort of teen comics. Both were reinventing themselves after the crisis. Both were dealing with the imminent threat of nuclear war. Both have American superheroes battling communist soldiers. The Green Lantern story leads a little more on the hawkish conservative side, with Guy Gardner being unambiguously right about the intentions of Gorbachev and the Soviet Union. The Justice League story suggests that this approach is maybe a bit naive, and the situation is more complicated. However, both stories do suggest that the then current geopolitical status quo of a stalemate between these two superpowers was probably the best option for both countries and the world at large. It's also worth mentioning that around this same time period, Steve Englehart was doing a creator-owned comic for Marvel under their Epic line called Coyote. In issue 15 and 16, I believe the hero disguises himself as Ronald Reagan and tries to talk Nikita Gorbachev into lessening the nuclear stockpile of both countries. And of course, it doesn't necessarily happen, but
Now, excuse me, despite the subject matter, neither comic seems to be particularly grim. Both are full of humor as well as lots of big, bombastic superhero action. They're bright, they're big, they're bold, and with the main intention of being entertaining the reader rather than bumming them out or lecturing them. The Justice League comic goes extra hard on the one-liners and jokes. This era of the comic is referenced these days by comics fans as the blah ha ha era of the Justice League. Both do a better job of delivering fun adventure rather than providing in-depth analysis of the American and Russian empires in geopolitical conflicts or explaining the struggles of capitalism versus communism. You don't really learn what communism or totalitarianism is or why it's bad other than the leaders are corrupt and lie to you. If there's there's little, if any, depiction of what life must be like for an ordinary Soviet system living under oppressive regimes.
I'm also a little bit curious as to how the pitches for these stories came about. These comics came out like right after each other and right after Crisis in Infinite Earths, and the Green Lantern story even references Legends, which was another DC Comics crossover event at the time that kind of sought to expand the status quo of the new DC Comics superhero universe. So the writers had to have been aware of each other's stories, and the fact that the Red Rockets are created in the Green Lantern story, show up for a fight in the Justice League story, and then later become part of the Justice League like a few months down the road. Um, basically the Justice League comic officially became Justice League International. But that shows there must have been some sort of editorial coordination. Okay, so both of these comics were definitely part of the 80s cultural zeitgeist. They engaged with the kind of us versus them, United States versus Russia dichotomy. They definitely tap into nuclear paranoia of the time, and of course, they both are, adhere to that common fear of mutually destroyed destruction. Yet these comics are entertaining, they're light, and they're fun at the same time. Again, the Green Lantern story, a little bit more clear in its political standpoint, and leans slightly towards hawkishness, while the Justice League story is a little bit more middle of the road. But both do provide an interesting look into Cold War politics as it relates to superhero adventures. Okay, so that's about it. Thank you very much for watching. I do appreciate it. You guys have a great day. Thanks.